So I'm going to begin with a short verse from the opening line of the poem John Scotus Eruigena at Leon, which was recited by Fanny Howe, the poet, and Patrick Hedeman on the opening night, and move from there. It describes, as was mentioned on the opening night, Eriugena's journey from Ireland to Leon in France. So the paper is called Eriugena, a Celtic Mystic. An island as of chalk, the sky standing in for the sea, the beach a reach of blue. In cove, a subtlety of air laps the eyes, a bob like barks come from afar, and the viator standing there, poised. The undercurrent of air escaping him, tossed to and fro, gave wretch from its angle of purchase upon the world, capsized, head now careened against the suddenness of rock, eyes whiplashed into new prospects. God has created things as numerous as his glory, hilaritas. So these lines by Jacques Derras's poem describe Eriugena's voyage from his native Ireland to France in the 9th century. They echo the images of Eriugena's dream, which we've just seen, travelling from the deep caverns of shadow and light onto that beach of blue and sky standing in for the sea. The dream speaks musical, mystical words for water, darkness, light, and sky in the three languages spoken by Eriugena himself: Greek, Latin, and his native Irish, Ishka, Dorchadas, Brúdroch, Solus, Shketimini, Vlas. This was his mother tongue. John Scotus Eruigena, homo viator, celebrant of sacred light in caves, waves, and clouds, thinker of the impossible, poet of hilaritas. Eriugena, meaning Irish-born in Latin, was a cosmopolitan avant la lettre. He was a migrant mystic who found his home everywhere, even in exile, while never leaving his Celtic soul behind. Which is why James Joyce, his émigré compatriot, so identified with him. In his famous lecture on Ireland, Island of Saints and Sages, delivered in exile in Trieste in 1907, Joyce celebrates his Irish predecessors thus. I quote, "John Scotus Eruigena was a mystical pantheist who translated from the Greek the books of mystical theology of Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, patron saint of the French nation." And he goes on. He accredits his fellow Irishmen with exerting a deep influence on European thought, and almost in the same breath refers to him as John Duns Scotus. Now, while some commentators see this conflation between the two Scoti, John Scotus Eruigena and John Duns Scotus, as a clerical error, I believe there is a more felicitous association at work. Joyce sensed, I think, the secret affinity between these two émigré Celtic minds. Indeed, he was happy to add the Welsh Celt, Pelagius, to this band of migrant Scoti, proudly declaring himself, that is James Joyce, a Pelagianist, a plagiarist of Pelagianism. The motif of mystical migration was central to ancient Irish Christianity. The peregrinatio, as it was called, was a legendary Celtic exercise known in Gaelic as imrav and in Latin as circumnavigatio. It named a maritime sailabout, where the voyager departed from Ireland into the unknown, either to experience a green navigatio, where one touched shore in distant lands, or a white navigatio, where one disappeared under the waves. These were bold times, and the peregrinatio pro Christi admitted both green and white martyrs to its kingdom. The mystical Scoti were not just Irish, of course, though Eriugena counted many compatriots in his émigré band and would be followed in his continental journey by later sages, Irish sages, like Columbanus, Gallus, and Peter of Ireland. No, as mentioned, migrant Scoti also included the Welsh scholar Pelagius, known in Gaelic as seafarer, and the Scots sage Dun Scotus, who migrated to France and Germany in the 13th century. Let us spread sail and set out to sea, Eriugena 4, quoted earlier by Villemin. All these Celtic migrants embarked on missions of maritime exile. And one could just imagine them landing on foreign coasts like aliens arriving from nowhere, odd-looking monsters appearing through the mists. And the journey abroad was as much one of minds as of maps. The going beyond often landed them in strange places, heretical topographies. Here is what Dermot Moran, my friend and colleague, has to say about Erugena's Celtic heresies in The Irish Mind in 1984. I quote, "The accusation of heresy excluded Eriugena from the main Western philosophical tradition for many centuries. Yet even in his own time, he was regarded as an outsider, a vir barbarus, as the Vatican librarian terms him, an advina, a famous Irishman, scotum illum. He stood out as a stranger in France. Presumably he coined the name Eriugena to express this curious phenomenon, an Irishman versed in philosophical wisdom." And Dermot adds, "Irish traits which have been adduced include Erugena's love of nature, his resistance to authority, which reminds one of Columbanus, his use of imagery of sea voyaging and peregrination, which recalls Brendan the Navigator, who discovered America, or the Winifred Strabo's remark that wandering was second nature to the Irish. His love of learning," adds Dermot, "might also suggest a schooling in the famous monasteries of early Ireland." Others, notably poets like Joyce, Pound, Yeats, and Borges, have all observed the Irish features of Erugena's mind. Joyce makes much of this in his Trieste lecture, as mentioned, and Borges agrees heartily with Joyce. Commenting on what he sees as a mystic liaison between Eriugena, Berkeley, and Joyce, Borges has this to say in a 1982 interview in the Craneville Journal. I quote, "As an outsider looking on successive Irish thinkers, I have been struck by unusual and remarkable repetitions. Berkeley was the first Irish philosopher I read, followed by Wilde, Shaw, and Joyce, and finally there was John Scotus Eruigena. I loved reading his De Divisione Naturae, which taught that God creates himself through the creation of his creatures in nature. I discovered that Berkeley's doctrine of the creative power of the mind was already anticipated by Eriugena's metaphysics of creation, and that this in turn recurred in several other Irish writers whose thinking is remarkably akin to Eriugena's system of things coming from the mind of God and returning to him. I love the idea that all genuine creation stems from a metaphysical nothingness, the nihil, what Eriugena calls the nihil of God, which resides at the heart of our existence." End of quote. Eriugena was a key figure of the Celtic intellectual diaspora of medieval Europe. In the 9th century, he left Ireland for Lyon, France, where he spent many years at the court of King Charles the Bald, writing his great mystical treatise on nature, Paraphysium. His impressive oeuvre also counted a significant body of poems full of Celtic puns and hilarities, as well as his monumental translation of the patristic mystic, Denis the Areopagite, from Greek into Latin. But Eriugena was not alone. His band of brothers included many other Irish scholars, amongst them Sedulius Scotus, Martin Hiberniensis, and Fergus of Lyon. Ezra Pound praises Eriugena and his migrant compatriots for what he calls their famous wit or hilaritas, and for bringing, quote, Greek learning and the Eastern patristic traditions into the Carolingian world. This merry troop of Celts made up what Christopher Bamford calls an ecumenical cosmopolitanism, which he explains thus. To be a Celt meant to be at home everywhere. It is to have the gift of languages. We heard the 3 Eriugena languages at the beginning of the video. The ability to empathize and be at one with everyone and everything. It is to be dialogue incarnate, conversation, to know the word, logos, in the words. And it's interesting, as Dermot and William reminded us, that the Paraphysium itself, his book on nature, is a dialogue. Central to the hilaritas of Celtic mysticism was the ability to embrace opposites and dance with dualities. Just think of the encircling animals and interlacing plants in the great illuminated Irish manuscripts. This particular image is from the Book of Kells. Greyhounds, whirligigs, donkeys, morning glory, fir trees, ferns, strangers, gods and monsters. A divine animal, human, vegetal comedy, if ever there was one. Or think of the impishly mischievous verses of the ancient Celtic bards, or the vagina-gaping shillingigs splayed over sacred Irish thresholds. When it came to philosophy, Eruigena's comic vision was somewhat more epistemological. It meant replacing the standard metaphysical logic of either-or with the capacious dialectical logic of both-and. Here the old polarities of grace versus nature, divine versus human, infinite versus finite, light versus darkness, spirit and earth, etc., were overcome in a daring eagle's flight, to use Eruigena's choice metaphor in commenting John's Gospel. This mystical flight went beyond the polar alternatives of apophatic and cataphatic theology and anticipated Cusanus's coincidentia oppositorum by many centuries, and is also thought to have influenced the later mystical dialectics of German and Romantic idealism, again mentioned by Dermot this morning. Bamford celebrates this mystical dance of opposites in his commentary on Eruigena's homily on the prologue of St. John, entitled The Voice of the Eagle, the Heart of Celtic Christianity. He claims that Eriugena possessed, I quote, an impeccable ability to tolerate contradiction and paradox, but also sheer chaos and confusion. End of quote. There was no light without darkness, Eriugena believed. Creation was from non-being to being and returned anatheistically to a divinity before and beyond being. Creatio ex nihilo meant just that, ex nihilo, understood as the fertile chaos of Korah, the tossing tumult of tohu bohu, light emerging from the inner womb of the cave, the formless void of the waters described in Genesis 1. And Catherine Keller, who's amongst us and will be speaking tomorrow, has much to say about all this. Eriugena himself makes no opposition between being and consciousness or consciousness and nature. These are complementaries within a single unity, poles of a unique process, whose ground is divine consciousness and whose existence is divine procession. In this sense, Eriugena thought philosophy based on human thinking, or mens, and theology based on divine revelation, logos, were commensurable. And he saw a similar dialectic at work between cosmology and anthropology. Christ was cosmic, coexisting with nature from the beginning of creation to the end of time, as in Proverbs 8. The sun and the earth, his spreading wings. So Jesus Christ was a second incarnation. We'll come back to that. This dialectic of natural creation may be seen, in part at least, as a distinctly Celtic quality of thought. There's a deep love of the earth in Eriugena, notes Bamford, quote, understood in the largest sense as coextensive with the cosmos. We may think here of the modern Celt, Teilhard de Chardin, whose love of geology and the rock stuff of the earth led him to a profoundly enchrysted understanding of evolution. Such is the Celtic earth into which Christ incarnated, and with whose destiny he united himself, when from his broken body on the cross blood and water flowed, forth into the broken body of the earth, making him forever the spirit and earth his body. It follows from this that nature and the sensuous world are sacramental, that is, things, beings, and events as theophanies, manifestations of the divine. Everything in God, God in everything. End of Bamford quote. Yet, to say God is in everything is not to say God is everything. God is in being, but at the same time beyond being, and before being. In short, God is not nature, that would be pantheism, but is everywhere in and through nature, panentheism. The Creator creates creatures from nothing and is in the creature, but is not of the creature. Quote, divine wisdom is the creating cause of all things, is created in all things that it creates, and contains all things in which it is created. pure music. John O'Mara comments on the pantheism question thus, quote, "Should we say then that God is all things and all things are God?" Eruigena explicitly confronts himself with the charge of pantheism. He would not do so if he did not feel that he had given apparent grounds for it. But neither would he have done it if he did not feel that he could exonerate himself from it. End of quote. The same things that exist in God as potency, that is, the monad, exist in nature as actual. The two are only separated by the nothing, the darkness of the cave, the crack between God and nature that unites and divides at once. Eruigena's God is a cracked God, and, as we say in Ireland, is great crack, a trickster, a playmaker, a joyous creator. Just like the ludic figures depicted in the marginalia of the great Celtic illuminated manuscripts, ferried by Irish scholars to ancient libraries of the European continent, where they can be found to this day. Nowhere more famously than in the special section of Scripti Scotici in St. Gallen Monastery Library in Switzerland, where Columbanus and Gallus carried many manuscripts in their peregrinatio. Of this mystical interplay between creator and created, between invisible maker and visible made, Eriugena himself writes, I quote, "We should not understand God and the creature as two things removed from one another, but as one and the same thing. For the creature subsists in God, and God is created in the creature in a wonderful and ineffable way, making himself manifest, invisible, making himself visible." End of quote. But precisely because the divine nature is above and beyond being, it's also different from what it creates within itself. Quote again, Eriugena, "Nothing, nihil, is the ineffable, incomprehensible, and inaccessible clarity of the divine goodness, which, because it is above being, is unbeknown to all intellects, and while it is contemplated by itself, is not, was not, and never will be. Hence it is called darkness. The divine goodness, which is called nothing, descends from itself to itself, as it were, from nothing to something." In tune with the title of his conference, Making Metaphor Mysticism, let me recall that one of the most profound and intriguing metaphors used by Eriugena to communicate the ineffable mystery of Genesis is that of running. Kuren. God is a divine relay runner between nothing and something, between creating and created. The Deus curans par excellence, as Eriugena calls him. Eriugena's metaphor of the running God is an apt expression of the panentheist notion of creation as a giant river of love coursing through all beings, human, animal, mineral, and divine. Here is how Eriugena plays with the Greek etymology to make his metaphorical point. Quote, "When theos is drawn from the verb theo, I run, it is rightly interpreted as the one who runs, curens recte intelligitur. Because God runs across everything that exists and is never impeded, he fills all in his course. As in the verse of scripture, his word runs with swiftness." Psalm 147. And Eriugena develops this metaphor of the Deus curans as follows. If God is therefore called the one who runs, curens digitur, it is because he causes everything that exists to run from a state of non-existence to a state of existence. And again, the world is unfurled from one end of the world to the other, and he runs with haste across all existing beings. That is to say, that the Word creates them all instantaneously, and that the Word becomes all in all. And then even as the Word continues to subsist in itself, it is unfurled across all existing being, and this extension itself is constitutive of all things. Eriugena concludes his reflections on divine running, curare, by linking the usually separate notions of making, facere, seeing, videre, and being, esse. I quote, "In God, the act of running through everything that exists is no different from his act of seeing everything that exists, but everything that exists is produced, made, concurrently by his running and by his seeing. Sicut videndo, ita, et currendo, fiunt omnia." Talk about mysticism, making, and metaphor. Eriugena's Your Only Man. In sum, the import of Eriugena's message is that the divine is no longer a static metaphysical idea hiding away in some transcendental heaven, Au contraire, it is an integral part of all created beings, like shining from shook foil, as the Scotist Gerard Manley Hopkins puts it. Eruigena presents us with a panentheistic theophany of existence as both phenomenal appearance, apparitio, and metaphoric making, logos apophantikos. So it's phenomenon and logos apophantikos. Running is the poetic figure par excellence for the divine current of creation in nature. Phusis, nature, is poiesis, making. As in Scripture, where we read of the divine as a running brook in the Psalms, or a running deer, Song of Songs, or an electrical current of lightning running through the sky, Luke 17, or John, the favourite disciple, running to the tomb of Christ in order to witness the rebirth of life. So too deity runs like a lightning brook through creation, connecting and reconnecting all things to itself and to each other, from beginning to end. Before ending, I would like to add a final word about the three mystic Scoti, Scotus Eruigena, Duns Scotus, and Pelagius Scotus. Like Eruigena, Duns Scotus emigrated to France, where he taught for many years, before being banished to Germany, where he died in Cologne. Also like Eruigena, Duns Scotus was denounced as stupid, Sotus Scotus. Indeed, his middle name, Duns, after his Scottish birthplace, became the eponymous Duns. That's his hand. Stupidity was, of course, a cautionary euphemism for heresy. Neither Scoti, Eruigena or Duns, were exempt on this front, joining their fellow Celt Pelagius in the stocks for their beliefs. I'm thinking particularly here of the three thinkers' teachings on, one, the original goodness of all creation, against Augustinian doctrines of original sin, fallenness, and predestination, and two, the notion of creation as a continuous incarnation, en sarcosis, a Celtic Christian persuasion sometimes leading to the charge of theosis, namely, the potential divinization of created nature, especially human nature. For the three mystic Celts, grace and nature were one. Being was deemed either univocal, continuous, or dialectically interconnected. And human thought and divine revelation were considered entirely compatible. Reason and revelation, Eruigena claimed, are not two things. They are Siamese twins. Quote, there are not two studies, he says, one of philosophy and one of religion. True philosophy is true religion, and true religion is true philosophy. Duns Scotus, for his part, insisted on the radical univocity of being, ranging from the divine to the natural, and inspired the later Catholic mystic Gerard Manley Hopkins to develop a quintessentially Scotist poetics of inscape and instress, a vision celebrating the inherent divinity of all beings, counter-original, spare, strange, as Hopkins says in his poem Pied Beauty. Here is Hopkins in another poem, identifying the cosmic Christ with all mortal things, not only human eyes and limbs, but wells, stones, dragonflies, and birds. And Hopkins, himself a Jesuit who drew very much from God in all things, and the mystical side of Ignatius that we don't always hear a huge amount about, but we did last night. He identified with the mystical Ignatius, but also with Scotus as a Franciscan. Very important for him that Duns Scotus was a Franciscan mystic. In any case, here is Hopkins's very panentheist poem. As kingfishers, and of course kingfisher is Christ, as kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. As tumbled over rim in roundy wells, stones ring. Like each tucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself. Myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace, that keeps all his goings graces, acts in God's eye what in God's eye he is, Christ. For Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Most of Hopkins's mystical epiphanies were written while teaching in Dublin, in the very same national university where Joyce did his medical studies. And he too was considered cracked, psychotic, neurasthenic, and met with ecclesiastical censure for his writings. Not a single volume of his work appeared in his lifetime. And what of Pelagius? Yet another Scotus who shared deep affinities with Eriugena. From his belief in the perfectibility of nature to his repudiation of predestination, which Pelagius believed robbed humanity of its creativity, goodness, and freedom. And most radically, his celebration of God's presence in nature. Here is Pelagius. Look at the animals roaming the forest. Look at the birds flying across the sky. Look at the insects crawling through the grass. Look at the fish in the rivers and the seas. Look at the great trees of the forest. Look at your crops and your plants. God dwells in all of them. And he adds, there is no creature on earth in whom God is absent. When God pronounced that his creation was good, it was not only that his hand had fashioned every creature, it was that his breath had brought every creature to life. The presence of God's Spirit in all living things is what makes them beautiful, and if we look with God's eyes, nothing on earth is ugly. Joyce certainly saw the connections between the Scotisms of Duns, Eriugena, and Pelagius, and in Finnegan's wake enlists the Scoti in dialectical battle with the exponents of scholastic dogmatism. He gleefully arrays Eriugena against Aquinas in the battle of his arch-druid Balkelly, a composite of Irish panentheism and Berkeleyan idealism, contesting the orthodoxy of Aristotelian Thomism. But that's a debate for another time. The clock ticks. So to conclude, Eriugena was certainly no stranger to controversy. His rejection of Augustinian predestination as what he called a most cruel and stupid madness was censured in the Synod of Valence in 1855, where his work was condemned as Scots porridge, pultus sculptorum, and worse still, the invention of the devil, commentum diaboli. But in spite of much opposition during his lifetime, Eriugena continued to insist that all persons are summoned to be saints, and that all beings, including animals, reflect attributes of God, towards whom all are capable of progressing and to which all ultimately return. Eriugena was a firm believer in apokatastasis, or universal reconciliation, which held that the world would eventually be restored and reunited. He is said to have been stabbed to death by the quills of jealous rivals in Malmesbury Abbey, England. Surprise, surprise. I forgive you, Louise. As he completed his mystical commentary of St. John's Gospel. Eriugena was later condemned for heresy in 1225 by a papal bull and was neglected for many centuries, as we heard this morning, before catching the notice of Cusanus, Bruno, Spinoza, and later again enjoying a revival in the 18th and 19th century in the works of German mystics and dialecticians, especially Hegel, Schelling, and Schopenhauer. And his legacy happily continues to this day. We heard this morning about how the Eriugena Society under Williman's presidency at the moment flourishes, and by just looking at the program for this conference and seeing how many wonderful Eriugena papers are being offered by young scholars. But despite his Celtic experience of exile, heresy, and controversy, Eriugena never lost his sense of hilaritas. His poems are full of wit and mischief. And the ancient historian William of Malmesbury recounts this anecdote of repartee with King Charles the Bald of Leon. When the king asked Eriugena at dinner, quid distat inter sotum et scotum, what separates a sot, drunkard, from an Irishman, Eriugena replied, tabula tantum, only a table. Looking at the king in the eye. I have no doubt that Eriugena would also have enjoyed the mischievous humour of the ancient Irish poem about Pangur Bawn, a cat who plays with a mouse as the scholar plays with a manuscript. I'll end with this. I and Pangur Bawn, my cat, 'tis a like task we are at. Hunting mice is his delight. Hunting words, I sit all night. When a mouse darts from its den, oh, how glad is Pangur then. Oh, what gladness do I prove when I solve the doubts I love. So in peace our tasks we ply, Pangabone, my cat, and I. In our arts we find our bliss. I have mine, and he has his. Practice every day has made Pangur perfect at his trade. I get wisdom day and night, turning darkness into light. Thank you.